Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into the absolutely fascinating history of Ashur. He's this ancient god who essentially became the ultimate political tool for the mighty Assyrian Empire. You know, it's incredibly rare in history to find a deity whose entire existence, evolution, and eventual downfall perfectly mirrors the rise and fall of a single political state. But as you'll see, Ashur is that exact mind-blowing exception. I want you to imagine standing in an ancient, kind of dimly lit temple. You're watching a newly crowned human monarch walk up to the altar. Then, suddenly, a high priest steps right up, literally strikes the king across the cheek, and shouts this powerful chant: "Ashur is king! Ashur is king!" Just imagine that. This startling ritual instantly set the stage for who was really calling the shots. The human ruler? Well, he was just an earthly proxy. The true sovereign of the entire empire was divine. To understand how this god pulled off such an incredible rise to power, we're going to track his journey through 5 distinct eras: the god without a face, mayor, king and conqueror, the imperial mastermind, stealing Marduk's crown, and finally, the afterlife of Ashur. Let's get right into it. Section 1, the god without a face, a deity with no original personality. This whole thing starts with a massive paradox that makes Ashur completely unique compared to basically any other ancient pantheon.
Seriously, how does a city become a god? It's a really surprising question, right? Because we usually think of gods founding cities, not the other way around. But to the ancient Assyrians, the answer to this was totally foundational to their entire worldview.
The god Ashur was completely, 100%, inseparable from the physical space he was named after. In fact, historians actually suggest he literally started out as the deified cliff over the Tigris River where the city of Assur was built. They share the exact same name, representing the city, the empire, and the national deity all at once. Unlike other Mesopotamian gods who had these incredibly rich, dramatic mythologies or cool storm powers, Ashur had none of that. No magic weapons, no wild family feuds at Thanksgiving. He was a complete theological blank slate. And far from being a weakness, this lack of backstory was actually his greatest asset. It meant future Assyrian kings could easily mold and adapt him to fit literally whatever political agenda they needed at the time. Because he didn't have a human face or a distinct persona, Ashur was represented by this constantly evolving array of visual symbols. I mean, we're talking a mountain god flanked by water goddesses, a simple bull altar, a wild goat, a cone, and then later, famously, that triumphant sun disk hovering over the Neo-Assyrian kings. Basically, his image was whatever the state needed it to be. Moving right along to Section 2, Mayor, King, and Conqueror, tracking the divine promotions. Let's look at how Ashur's power leveled up directly alongside the ambitions of his human rulers. Back in the 3rd millennium BCE, Ashur was really just a localized city spirit. But as Assyrian kings started expanding their territory, Ashur got a major theological upgrade. Ambitious rulers like Shamshi-Adad pushed this clever merger, basically elevating Ashur to the level of the ancient supreme Mesopotamian god Enlil. So boom, Ashur was no longer just the mayor of a cliff. He was now a king of the gods. There's this fantastic quote from an old Assyrian seal: "Ashur is king, Sululu is the governor of Assur." It perfectly captures that early power dynamic. The human ruler was merely the governor, while the god wore the actual crown. The absolute political brilliance here: any rebellion against the human governor was automatically a rebellion against the divine king, Ashur himself. It's a pretty bulletproof setup. Which brings us to Section 3, the imperial mastermind. Expanding the cosmos. As Assyria transformed into a massive, unstoppable empire, Ashur's job description had to drastically change to keep up. The new ideological blueprint became simple, highly effective, and completely terrifying for Assyria's neighbors. You see, expanding the empire wasn't just pitched as some basic land grab for wealth. Oh no, it was framed as a divine, cosmic mission. The king, acting as Ashur's earthly proxy, viewed the outside world as pure chaos. By conquering it, he wasn't just taking territory, he was literally bringing order to the universe under Ashur's watchful eye. What's truly wild here is how completely fluid Ashur's family tree was. As Assyria conquered southern Mesopotamia, which, by the way, had much older, deeply respected gods, the Assyrians just casually rewrote Ashur's genealogy. They gave him a prestigious consort like Melisu and a heroic son like Ninurta just to absorb the prestige of those conquered southern gods. Meanwhile, his only native relative, Sharua, shifted between being a wife, sister, or daughter, depending on what the theological narrative of the day required. Talk about a complicated family dynamic, right? Okay, let's dive into Section 4, Stealing Marduk's Crown, the ultimate theological hostile takeover, because incorporating other gods just wasn't enough for everyone. By the Neo-Assyrian period, kings like Sennacherib were totally done negotiating with the older Babylonian religion. In 689 BCE, King Sennacherib brutally destroyed the city of Babylon. And to justify this unthinkable act, he essentially put Babylon's chief god, Marduk, on trial in a brilliant, albeit ruthless, piece of state propaganda known as the Marduk Ordeal. The text completely subverts traditional Babylonian festivals. It depicts Marduk as a captive, bleeding in a perilous river ordeal, while Ashur presides overhead as the supreme judge. It was the ultimate, calculated humiliation of a rival deity. The state literally went to the lengths of committing state-sponsored plagiarism. Seriously, Assyrian scribes took the great Babylonian creation epic, the Enuma Elish, and simply erased Marduk's name, pasting in Ashur's name instead. With just a few strokes of a stylus, Marduk is gone, and Ashur, or Anshar, is suddenly written in as the ancient hero who slayed chaos at the dawn of time. But Sennacherib went one step further. To make absolutely sure Ashur owed nothing to the older generations of gods, the king decreed that Ashur had no parents at all. He gave him the ultimate superhero origin story: self-creation. He claimed Ashur simply brought himself into being entirely from nothingness. This bold move ensured his total, indisputable political and genealogical superiority over everyone else. Now, Section 5, the afterlife of Ashur, the surprising reality of an imperial god. This brings us to a really fascinating question. What on earth happens to a god whose entire identity, name, and purpose is tied to an empire once that empire actually falls? Well, first we have to realize there is a massive gap between what the Assyrians claimed in their propaganda and what they actually did in reality. Despite all those terrifying claims that enemies who violated oaths to Ashur must be completely crushed, the historical reality is quite surprising. Assyrian kings were actually remarkably tolerant of foreign gods. They rarely forced mass religious conversions. Honestly, as long as conquered peoples paid their taxes and acknowledged Ashur was the boss, they could totally keep worshipping their own local gods. But as we know, no empire lasts forever. In the year 614 BCE, the magnificent city of Ashur was brutally sacked by Median forces, and the great temple of Ashur, the physical, literal home of this mighty god, was reduced to ashes and rubble. You'd probably expect Ashur to just disappear completely from the history books right then and there. But remember how the Assyrians hadn't forcefully imposed their god on everyone else? Because of that, his cult actually survived peacefully for centuries after the empire collapsed. In places like Neo-Babylonian Uruk, dedicated Assyrian refugees maintained a thriving, independent sanctuary for him. In fact, hundreds of years later, well into the Parthian period, devoted worshippers were still quietly scratching Ashur's name into the ruins of his ancient temples. It's an incredible story of post-imperial survival. Which leaves us with a pretty powerful final thought. As we wrap up this explainer, we really have to ask ourselves, how much of this ancient blueprint for mixing divine mandate with political expansion still echoes in the empires of our modern world? When we see modern states blending national identity, supreme authority, and, some form of divine or moral justification, are we simply looking at the enduring legacy of the god without a face? I'll let you be the judge of that. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the history behind the power.